press record. Thank you. Great. Well, welcome everybody. Those of you who don't know me, my name is Paul Nash. It's my privilege to facilitate these network meetings, and it's our privilege to have John, who's actually one of the board members, one of our trustees, sharing with us this afternoon or this morning, wherever you are in the world. So thank you, John, for being willing to do that. So just a reminder of our format. By way of introduction, we just share anything that we're working on or that we know about that's being shared around child theology, that interest in projects or any updates or studies or projects. And then we'll hand over to John to share for up to half an hour, and then we'll have a good half an hour for us discussion and questions and planning for future meetings. So, and just to give you a kind of just lots of heads up, we'd hope to have had the next two meetings lined up, but we're struggling to get hold of one of our prospective speakers. So we've managed to unfortunately line up the next but one meeting rather than the next meeting. So if throughout our gathering today you think of something or somebody, please don't hesitate to come back to it at the end. So let's just take a moment's quiet to pray as we start our time together. Lord, we thank you for your eternal, unconditional love for us, for children and young people. That finishes with regardless. That finishes with unconditional. We thank you for your grace. We thank you for your wisdom that sees into the heart of childhood, that reflects your heart and your principles and your kingdom. And we thank you, Lord, that draws us together for what you've done in our lives and why we want to be here this afternoon, this morning, to share together, to learn more about your values, your priorities, your direction for our lives and ministry. We thank you for John and his willingness to share. We thank you for the heritage that he will come and bring with us, for that which reflects your movement over many generations. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Thank you. So we'll take up at past for at the very latest. If we finish earlier, we can do so. If you just like, if there's anything that you've been thinking about or sharing that you'd just like to share, and then you might just want to do a brief introduction to yourself, because there's probably, maybe not everybody knows everybody. Always Keith is an exception for most of these meetings, but so yeah, anything anybody's working on or news or anything like that.
Just to get it going, if I could, Paul, David Cronick, when we think of the next network meeting, David, who's here, yeah, I'm thinking very much that he might be a possibility. So I'm putting him on notice.
Right.
But towards the end, you can do that. I think the other thing is that just to say that when child theology started, some things, including child and childhood, were in the sociological jargon pre-paradigmatic, which is that they were under other umbrellas. They didn't come out from, a child didn't come out from education or family or something like that. In sociology, which is one of my professional disciplines, I'm astonished by the growth of studies of child and childhood worldwide. So I just want to say that child theology is not sort of in a silo. There are people who are exploring. So only yesterday I was just being told of conferences and new books that are coming out, and the recent one was silence and children, how childhood is represented. In some ways, the typical default mode has been silence about children or whatever. So over many centuries. But just to say that, really, yeah.
Great, thank you, King. That's children and silence are very, very interesting. Maybe it's a prayer book from parents. I don't know. So, Carolyn.
Just to say that I've literally come out of a meeting with Lucy Moore from the Growing Faith Foundation. So for our international colleagues, the Growing Faith Foundation was set up by the Church of England to join together church, household and school for the children and young people that are in those places and what faith looks like in those settings. And the Church of England is piloting a whole set of new worshipping communities in schools that are going to be co-led by children, young people and adults. And so our conversation was around the theology that underpins that. And Haddon, drawing on stuff that you've written in the Child Theology Movement booklets that I've been carrying around with me. It's very likely, Keith, that we're going to be using the 5 principles that were in Growth and Love that were in was it the Nepal or the Penyang consultation? You first presented them. You're on mute, Keith.
There's a Should we I'll give the name of the book?
Just to say, but thanks a lot. They were mentioned first at a very early cutting edge, actually, in England.
Oh, well, there you go then. So they've been around a long time, but they're still being useful to help underpin, new innovative practice. So to encourage you all.
Great, lovely. Thank you very much. Good. Sounds a really interesting project. Thanks. Anyone else?
I'm those who don't know, I'm Sally. I'm sort of an academic, and one of the things I'm doing in March is I'm examining a PhD on child spirituality and holistic ministry in Ethiopia, which sounds like a very interesting potential contribution to this series of meetings for OCMS. So I'm looking forward to that. I haven't yet seen the PhD, so I don't really know very much about it at all. But I thought that was absolutely fascinating to look at that. I'm also doing a couple of vivas South Africa. For those of you who came to one of these meetings we had in South Africa, Chantel Weber was one of the presenters, and she invited me to examine a couple of her students. They're both looking at it's more young people than children, but sort of spiritual care and chaplaincy and ministry for incarcerated young people, but from a seeing spiritual care as a much more Christian thing than the way that we might use it in certainly England and Scotland, but it's definitely sort of religious chaplaincy. So, but those are interesting as well.
I'm just mindful the two of you never introduced yourselves, but
I did.
Sorry.
No, but
yeah, Sally did. I didn't.
So
I said I'm a sort of academic, which I am.
That's it. Is that all you go under now? Is it?
I'm a freelance academic.
I think Caroline might have a little bit more to say than that.
Yeah,
so
Caroline's much posher than that.
I am the Ministry with Children and Young People Officer for the Church of England, and a sort of academic.
Yeah. Actually, Caroline, you haven't done your PhD in one of these, have you?
No, I haven't. I haven't. Children and Holiness.
And Caroline has done a little bit of work with one of my students who looked at the children and holiness with with a younger age group as well. And I would imagine if other people are looking at Carolyn, Allison, and some others, that would make another really interesting.
Yeah, early years would be a really good subject to have a look at. Yeah.
I do love the idea that we're all volunteering other people tonight so far. We've been very, I don't know whether that's affirming or just, yeah. Anyway, we'll give each other the benefit of the doubt for the time being, shall we? So, okay, great. Thank you. Anybody else heard of anything or anything else? Doesn't have to be a major project. David, is it Anne or
Ali?
I couldn't quite see. It's the screen's too far away from.
It just says A. I didn't know whether it was Ali or not.
Right, David. Anything from you? Pardon?
Well, so my name's David Kronick. I am not an academic. I'm pretending to be one at the moment, trying to work on a PhD at Asbury Seminary, but have been involved in work with children, vulnerable children, specifically in Romania for a long time. I recently got a chapter or something published in the journal Missiology, which I passed along to Keith, and so I think this is what he was speaking of, perhaps presenting in the future, but looking at international development through the lens of child theology.
Great, well done. And can we ask what you're doing your studies in?
So that is kind of the overarching theme
well
of the dissertation. Yeah, that chapter is just a bit of the theoretical work.
Well, could I just say that it's really, I mean, I'm sorry, David, to have sort of bumped you possibly into this, but I was very, very interested in what you've written. The other thing I've just learned, I didn't know this, that Haddon Wilmer, ever young, has just produced a paper on child theology and Make America Great Again.
Oh, wow.
And so that's something we might like to ask him to give a trailer on that, but I would have thought it would be relevant at the moment. I mean, maybe child theology might be relevant in, how can I say it, redeeming, saving certain processes in the world.
Wow.
Great. I'm not saying I haven't read his paper, but I've just seen he's done one.
Great. Good. Well, David, thank you. I think Keith's right. It would be good to, if you'd be willing to do that at a future meeting, I think that would be really
definitely
nice. And in the flow of Keith, keep volunteering people. Haddon, that's anything you'd like to say on that, or is Keith?
No, I mean,
all your thunder?
The disciples were disputing about greatness, and there's a great dispute going on perpetually about greatness, led by Donald Trump, and you can see how monstrous it is. And yet, child theology, along with most of the church, has been completely silent on the issue.
Wow, I agree. That would be just wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah. The one of the other things I didn't mention, and it ties into the partly the Francis Young's Arthur's story at the Children's Hospital, where Paul as chaplain and I sort of support some training research. We're having a focus on working with non-verbal children, some of the theology behind that as well. But Francis's work is excellent. We're looking at how do you offer spiritual care to non-verbal, and what is our theology. Last night, Paul and I were listening to John Swinton give the Dennis Duncan lecture, and he again was touching on what does it mean to be made in the image of God.
Yeah. Right. Well, those of you who are just joining, what we're doing is just introducing ourselves and just sharing anything that we're working on or heard about with child theology. So welcome those of you who have just joined. I can't see all your names. My Sully's laptop is too far away for me to read all your names, so I'm apologising if I feel rude and not calling you by your any names on the screen. So and with my dyslexia, it could come out anyway, even if I could read it. So it could be entertaining any which way. So anybody else been working on anything?
Can I just drop something in to cheer you up? We're
Yeah.
based in Fort William, Scotland, and the local high has a few hundred children, and they've had a scripture union, or they've had a Christian union run one lunchtime a week for years. And the history teacher who comes to our fellowship, faithfully getting on running that with a fellow teacher. And for years there was one child, and they just kept on going and going.
Wow.
And then 2 years ago, that one child left, but our grandson started at the high, and he was the one child for 1 year. And
Wow.
half the town has been praying for that, you know. They now have this year 6 children.
Wow.
Now,
Wow.
that may not be much, but in Fort William, that's a real answer to prayer, something to rejoice over.
That's wonderful. In somebody's statistics, that's saying 600% growth, Leslie.
Yes.
So
Yes,
whatever way you cut it, that's
yes, yes.
wow. That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that story. It's great to hear it from that type of roots of, you know, because we you know, the benefit of the network is, you know, the work that's going on in from the roots to academia and studies and projects and, you know, face-to-face work and reflections. So yeah, it's lovely. Thank you. Anybody else? We're still okay for a couple of minutes, or you can just introduce yourself, and if you've not got anything to update on child theology, you can still introduce yourself if you'd like to.
Could I just say about Francis Young and the ministry to children or people without language?
Mm-hmm.
I think a great thing about Francis Young is that she insisted on Arthur's ministry to the rest of us, a ministry of the silent that she makes so much of. And you know, that was very important for us in the later stages of my participation in CTM.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. And I don't know whether if you've not had the experience, and in one way I hope you haven't, but that would be the demographic of the vast majority of children in hospices. They're long-term, not just palliative conditions, and the largest, you know, most of them would fall into that category, and it's a kind of one of those kind of unknown phenomena that's happening, and that's where many of them are being cared for, because they've got life-limited and life-threatening illnesses rather than being in palliative care. Corinne, can you help us with things that are being put in the chat? Because again, I'm sorry, it's too far away for my eyesight. So thank you.
Yeah, just to say that A. Walton, who has joined us a little bit earlier, they'll be remaining on mute just because they've got their 22-year-old girls with them.
Oh,
because they're a homeschooling mum, church planting wife, and so
lovely.
Very interested in child theology. So
perhaps put a message back and say to keep us grounded. Any children welcome. So you know, I can pop and get one of my spiritual play activities if need be. So, yeah, great. Anybody else? It's interesting that silence has come up twice this evening, this afternoon. That's quite a. I wouldn't have put of the commonality so far. That's not where I would have quite gone. So.
Hello, just to introduce myself, I'm Jen from the Scottish Bible Society. I'm the Children's and Youth Resources Manager. I just saw the advert for this. I feel I've stumbled into somebody's meeting, really, actually. But I'm sure I've heard John speak before, and I'm a big fan of George MacDonald, so that's why I'm here. So I'm sorry if I wasn't. I just saw the advert and I thought I could come along, so I did. I hope that's okay.
No, that's why you saw the advert, Jane, because you're
Okay,
welcome.
that's fine. Well, you sometimes wonder when you come into Zoom calls, was MD expecting MD different, but you know.
No, not at all. That's why we're getting people to introduce themselves, because they may not be known to any. No, that's an intentional part of having an open, inclusive group. So you're very, very welcome, Jen. Thank you. No,
thank you.
I was just about to say that as well. You're very welcome, Jen, and hope you enjoy being here. I'm Lucy, so I'm one of the trustees. And listening to people who said they are a bit academic or something, pretending to be academic, I'm going, well, I've been doing that for the last 10 years and a little bit more. So I'm a lecturer at the University of Derby, working with children and youth programme, but also run Muddy Church, which is looking at intergenerational approaches, but trying to connect people to the outside. So yeah, that's me.
right.
Hi, I'm Tanya, and Jen, I'm glad that you chimed in, because I joined a bit late and I was feeling the same way. Did I stumble into something where I don't belong? I'm actually in Toronto, Canada right now, and I saw the advertising. I work with the Canadian Baptists of Ontario and Quebec in the denominational level, so supporting our churches and pastors in children and family ministry. But I'm currently working on a doctorate. And I'm very interested, especially in the theology of the child, because I feel like a lot of our challenges that I see in our churches stem from our pastors don't actually have a theology of the child, and they're making decisions on what they're doing. Anyways, there's so many challenges I'm trying to address working with our churches. And so I'm really trying to study and work towards how do I help our pastors develop this theology of the child, and then from there, what it means to minister and disciple within the community of faith.
Wonderful. Well, as first-time visitors, you're very welcome to this network. Where, as you can see, we're hopefully very informal, very welcoming, and very open. We have these meetings every 3 months, yeah, you're very welcome. If you let us know if you want to put emails in the chat, so we can make sure you're invited to future ones. And no, what you're doing sounds right up, the values of who we are. And so
we partly meet at this time, so people in different time zones to us can join in. So it's purposeful to try and meet where people east west coast in particularly in North America could join.
Great.
And any previous stuff, Tanya and Jen, is on the website from other international gatherings as well. So, do use that as a resource, and it's got links to a lot of the publications that Child Theology Movement have done. So, have a little route around and do get in touch, and, give us your email address if you want us to include you in mailing lists and things.
So a little project I'm involved in. Some of you will know I've been very interested of placing the sick, poorly child in the midst. And next week, at a conference called Hand in Hand, we're launching our Comparing Scars with Jesus project, where we're doing a community arts project of inviting people, children, young people, and we might let a few adults play as well, of drawing and comparing scars with Jesus. So we're hopefully going to get a few contributions for that, and then we'll be doing a digital and probably a hard copy version of that resource. So we can try and get that information round to you when we launch nearly this time next week. So just really intrigued to see how that comes on. Well, that's Victoria. I wonder whether that's the Victoria who's helping me launch the project. It couldn't. So she obviously heard me talking about her.
Talking about me again.
There we are. Oh, it is you. Very good. Hello. I was just telling people we're launching the project next Friday. Great. Well, welcome. So it's past. Victoria, we've just been doing introduction, so perhaps we'll feel free to do after John's presentation. So just like to hand over to John, who's going to be sharing some reflections around George MacDonald and the new privilege of childhood in theology, which has been one of his passions and studies for a while now. And we're just really interested, and just Jen's, attendance here kind of suggests that we're onto something there of a connection and a passion. And so, John, thank you very much as one of our trustees of being willing to share from your studies and your interests. And then, so over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Well, before I share my presentation, I thought I'd just give you a minute background in terms of my, let's just call, relationship with George MacDonald. I mean, I've been aware of him since my childhood, but it was, and I remember reading his books in the Mitchell Library in Glasgow back in my teens. But it was particularly in the year 2016 when Stephen Prickett, sadly no longer with us, spoke to me in Cambridge, indeed at Trinity Hall, about my interest in projects, and I discovered too Stephen Prickett actually had a Methodist background, which I found quite intriguing because I'm a Methodist minister. So Stephen actually encouraged me to work on George MacDonald. So that's kind of where it sort of stems from. I can't believe it's almost 8 years ago now. In Aberdeen the following year, where I was living at the time, there was a George MacDonald conference which I attended, not as a contributor, but as a sort of auditor. But I did know the area and could show people around, like Huntly, for example, where George MacDonald came from. And then in 2018, I had my 3-month sabbatical, so I devoted to George MacDonald. And I actually stayed in Caroline's house for a few days in Sheffield because MacDonald had connections to Sheffield. So thank you, Caroline. But that gave me an opportunity to go right through the country and effectively look at virtually every archive with this MacDonald material. And then in 2019, I spent a month at Yale at New Haven in the States, looking at MacDonald's correspondence. Yale has about 4,000 letters. So, I mean, we compare that to King's College, which has also got an archive. It's got maybe 300 letters. Yale's got the biggest collection. And then this past year, some of you might be aware, I had 3 weeks at Wheaton College, particularly at the Wade Centre, which has a bit of a MacDonald collection. Not very much, to be honest. They say more than they really have. They probably got about 38 letters, I think, altogether. The rest of them are all copies. So that's basically my background. So I thought I would just share my presentation now. All being well. Oh. Can you all see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you can see a few quotes of authors who George MacDonald influenced in a very major way. I mean, G.K. Chesterton and C.S. Lewis in particular, but there's many others as well that would quote and say that MacDonald inspired them. And these are very common quotations of those particular authors. MacDonald, just quickly in terms of MacDonald, he was born in 1824, so this past year was actually his bicentenary, and there has been a number of major conferences at Wheaton, St Andrews, and there's been a few other meetings as well. For 40 years, MacDonald was a professor and lecturer of English literature. Now, not many biographers really pick up on that fact. They more concentrate on him as a novelist. But he was, in terms of his income, he was a lecturer in London and also in Manchester in English literature. And he was also a guest preacher, but interesting enough, he never ever took a preaching fee. and he probably preached at least twice every Sunday through all the years. He had a family of 11 children, and the family, in some ways, a bit like a sort of Swiss Family Robinson or a Von Trapp kind of family. They became they would go over the country putting on productions, say, of Pilgrim's Progress and other Shakespeare plays, and they became well known for that, particularly in the 1870s, 1880s, and people like Lewis Carroll would remark on that. But above all, MacDonald was a Christian, and the most important thing for him was the story of Jesus and in the Gospels, and everything else stemmed from that in terms of what he wrote about. And he particularly loved to think about children and childhood. And so I'm going to look for a short time with you just now in his, what we call his fairy tale writings of the 1860s. Now, appreciating he did write up until the mid 1890s. Many of his fairy tales were actually written in the 1860s. I suppose the other ones I'm not going to look at are Princess Goblin, Princess and Curdie, which came out in the early 1870s and the early 1880s. And there's also At the Back of Northland. There's a number, but as I say, a lot of his stories, he celebrates children and childhood, and he also reflects a lot on the birth of Christ as a child as well. So I'm going to go to my next slide here. Okay, these are pictures I've taken of places related to MacDonald's own childhood background. So this is off Speyside at Huntly. You can see at the top left corner, and then the castle at Huntly, the River Bogey, and then the house which is still there, the right-hand side of the picture. And there's also a picture of MacDonald being called Goody Goody, I'll refer to just in a moment. So once upon a time, I'll start my presentation now, when young princes and princesses were all plentiful, there was a scarcity of children's literature throughout the land. MacDonald himself recalled in his own childhood, we had very few books for children in those days. I suppose the books, if you go to any fireside at that time, the 1820s, particularly when MacDonald was a child, the most notable books would be the Bible, of course. There'd be maybe a prayer book, a hymn book. There might even be George Fox's Book of Martyrs, which is perhaps not you might want to encourage your children to read. But most vividly for George MacDonald was John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which, as I mentioned already, his wife actually did a production of Pilgrim's Progress Part 2, and they went all over the country presenting this in many theatres. Indeed, where I live currently in Gloucester, he came to Cheltenham twice, he came to Malvern, he came to Droitwich. So he went all over the country, probably many of the places. If you live in the UK, he probably landed in your place as well with a production of Pilgrim's Progress. It had material, I would suggest, for a young child, which would fire their young imaginations. And I remember reading Pilgrim's Progress as a child myself. Of course, there were dungeons, there were dragons, and there were giants, and there were swords. So I suppose it's quite exciting, perhaps, for a young boy. There was a derisive term at the time called goody two-shoes, which is why I'm using this picture. It's made famous through a book of the latter half of the 18th century, The History of Little Goody Two-Shoes. The person who put this picture, I'm not sure if it was in Punch or something, is showing George MacDonald telling one of his fairy tales, and there's almost like a sort of Alice sort of figure there, the bottom right-hand corner. And of course, I'll mention them in a moment, the strong links with MacDonald and Lewis Carroll. In Huntly, the Protestant faith was by and large which ruled the place, and it was particularly a form of what some people call federal Calvinism, which I suppose for MacDonald, it meant that things like art and culture were seen as as it were, of the devil. So you kept away from those sort of things. So there's even in some of MacDonald's stories, like Robert Faulkner, you have an image of, and it actually did actually happen. George McNeill's grandmother burnt her son's fiddle or a violin. She threw it in the fire. And indeed, George's own father, who was also called George, confiscated a copy of Walter Scott's Waverley novels. Didn't want his son to pick up such a degenerate book, which you might smile at now, of course. I suppose for him as a child, and in terms of his education, it was very didactic, and the literature he would receive was very moralizing. But when his mother died, and his mother died, and some biographers pick up on this, I think there was a really major, even psychological effect for young George, because I think he was only about 7 or 8 years old. I can't remember exactly. Relatively young, and indeed I actually had a letter of his mother to his cousin on my person this past year. I've returned it to its rightful owner, but I did actually have a letter of his mother. But his mother died, says, when he was a child, and then his father remarried. And his father, which is perhaps typical, I can even reflect my own father, mellowed with age. And indeed, we do know he regretted his decision to burn the Waverley novel. And then, as a young adult in his teens, MacDonald finally got hold of a copy of Grimm's fairy tales. By 1858, and by this stage, I'm kind of jumping forward in terms of his biography, but this is when he starts to produce his fantasy stories. So 1858, he's living in Huntly in Hastings on the South English coast. And under the patronage of Lady Byron, the poet's wife, he publishes his first novel, Fantasies. And in the top right-hand corner, I've got a row of first editions, and it's the third one from the left, which is Fantasies. And I'll refer to Adela Cathcart, which is the sort of greenish colour triple-decker towards the right-hand side of that picture. The picture in the top left is taken from Fantasies. And that's a picture of George it was actually taken in 1857, that picture of George in Algiers, where he'd gone for convalescence, paid for by Lady Byron. Fantasies he called a sort of fairy tale for grown-up people. In the story, on his 21st birthday, protagonist Anadis, which means sort of a path seeker, is transported into fairyland. And he watches as his bedroom simply dissolves, and that's what the artist Arthur Hughes is trying to depict in that picture, and is replaced by an enchanted forest. And by the way, people like C.S. Lewis pick up on these ideas and use the portal of the wardrobe. It's a similar literary device. So I quote from the book. It says, "My dressing table was an old-fashioned piece of furniture of black oak with drawers all down the front. These were deliberately carved in foliage, of which ivy formed the chief part. The nearer end of this table remained just as it had been, but in the further end, a singular range had commenced. I happened to fix my eye on a little cluster of ivy leaves. The first of these was evidently the work of the carver. The next looked curious. The third was unmistakable ivy. And just beyond it, a tendril of clematis twined itself about the gilt handle of one of the drawers." Later in 1893, MacDonald was to say in a paper he gave called The Fantastic Imagination, I quote, "For my part, I do not write for children, but for the childlike, whether of 5 or 50 or 75. And after publishing Fantasies in 1858, MacDonald made the turn to writing fairy tales for the young, such as, and it's still in print even now, the very witty story The White Princess, about the young girl who didn't have gravity. And that first appeared in 1862 in a Christmas annual called Beatons. And then just a couple of years later, Golden Key, also still in print. In other words, these fairy tales are still popular. The Golden Key, a touching and beautiful story, which first appeared in Dealings with the Fairies, 1867. And that was the same year in which his volume, Unspoken Sermons Series 1, was published, 1867. And the very first sermon in that volume, and I'm quoting from it there, is The Child in the Midst. I always find that very interesting, that should be the very first sermon he publishes, The Child in the Midst. I somewhat compare it, as a Methodist minister, I compare it to Wesley's 44, where Wesley starts with salvation by grace, MacDonald starts with Child in the Midst, which in a sense is sort of turning theology on its head, looking at it from a different perspective. And I quote there about receiving, if you're receiving a child in the name of Jesus, you're receiving Jesus himself. To receive Jesus is to receive God. Therefore, to receive the child, sorry, it's just cut off here, is to receive God himself. A couple of years later, again, in his very first triple, oh, by the way, so that unspoken sermon, he actually did preach it. Even though I know it's called Unspoken, he did preach it. I know, for example, July the 27th, 1855, in his home church, which was a congregational church in Huntly. And that building, by the way, still stands as well. It's now a baker. 1864, MacDonald publishes his first triple-decker. Is called Adela Cathcart. And what he does here is he takes some of the fairy tales he's already published in magazines, like that one in Beaton's Christmas Annual, and he puts them all together in a book, and he effectively sets up what you might call a storytelling club for the 12 days of Christmas. And it all centres around a young girl called Adela, who is terribly unwell. So what friends do, they gather around this young child in her sick bed, as it were, and they hatch a plan to effectively try, you might call it a literary cure, by telling stories, in other words. And the very first story Adela hears is The White Princess. In the book, Adela Cathcart, Adela's aunt asks the question, what is the moral of it? With an emphasis on the word moral. The answer comes back, even if wholly fictitious, a good story is always true. Unlike Mrs. Cathcart, someone who did enjoy The White Princess was MacDonald's close friend, the Reverend Charles Dodgson of Christ Church College, Oxford, better known as Lewis Carroll, and he's in the centre of the picture on the left, and it is one of his photographs. The one in the top right-hand corner, that was a picture by Lewis Carroll as well, taken in Hampstead, 1863. MacDonald children adored Lewis Carroll. They even called him Uncle Dodgson. And on May the 9th, 1863, Lewis Carroll gave George MacDonald's wife Louisa a partially self-illustrated draft of Alice's Adventures Underground. And then she duly read it to her 11 children in their home at Tudor Lodge, which is in the east side of Regent's Park. And Greville, who's in this picture here, he's the boy with his fairly long hair next to his mother. Greville actually says or exclaims, there ought to be 60,000 stories like it. And so this encouraged Lewis Carroll to finally publish his story under a revised title, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. By that stage, it actually doubled its length, and it was just published just in time for Christmas. And the artist, rather than it being, as it were, self-illustrated, John Tenniel provided 42 wood engraved illustrations for it. When Carroll first met, and he's actually sitting next in this picture here, the girl in the dark hair is Mary. Her parents actually gave the nickname of Effie, and very sadly, she died of tuberculosis in her late at age 27. So she's sitting here next to Lewis Carroll, and interestingly enough, Lewis Carroll with his child friends, which of course included Alice Liddell, the person he corresponded the longest with was actually Mary MacDonald. And there's many letters which you might read in the two volumes of the letters of Lewis Carroll. And she was only 6 years old when Carroll first met her, and they met in an art studio belonging to Alec Munro, who created a sculpture. If you go to Hyde Park, this is my friend Kay from Shetland, picture on the left side, is it's called The Boy and the Dolphin, made by this artist Alexander Munro, and it's actually, the boy is actually Greville, George's and Louisa's son. He became a Harley Street physician, by the way, but you can still go there and you can see the sculpture. It's all made in marble. Mary was actually Carroll's first child friend, and he called her the Kensington Chicken. And I've read some of the letters that they kind of horrify me the way he spoke to her, but he's using a lot of irony in the letters. And then later, Mary actually got engaged to another artist herself, Ted, but say she died of tuberculosis. MacDonald, and arguably, Lewis Carroll, and also the other person thinking of was Charles Kingsley and his Water Babies, were not merely helping to create a more playful and less earnest form of children's literature, but I would suggest they were helping to foster a new attitude towards children and towards childhood. A child's imagination should be cultivated and not rather than being curbed, which would have been George's own educational backgrounds. Maybe even it was not just that children needed to learn how to become adults, but that adults also needed to learn how to become children. Again, just as Jesus said. A Delicate Cart, the title, by the way, was not actually MacDonald's choice, but his publisher. It begins with these words: "It was the afternoon of Christmas Eve," and in the first chapter, it's titled Christmas Eve. The narrator is full of festive anticipation as he tells how much he loves this time of year. Every year, he says, as Christmas approaches, I begin to grow young again. And I'm going to use this quote here from A Delicate Cart, which is very poignant. And then I'm going to also read another quote from David Elginbrod, which was published just a year earlier. In fact, I'll start with the David Elginbrod quotes. "There is a childhood in which we have to grow, just as there is a childhood we must leave behind. A childlikeness, which is the highest aim of humanity, and a childishness from which but few of those who are counted the wisest amongst men have freed themselves in their imagined progress towards the reality of things." Not very gender inclusive, but there we are. And this quote is from a Delicate Cart, and I put it on the screen. "The winter is the childhood of the year. Into this childhood of the year came the child Jesus. And into this childhood of the year must we all descend. It is as if God spoke to each of us according to our needs. My son, my daughter, you are growing old and cunning. You must grow a child again. With my son, this blessed birth time. You are growing old and selfish. You must become a child. You are growing old and careful. You must become a child. You are growing old and distrustful. You must become a child. You are growing old and petty and weak and foolish. You must become a child. You are growing old and petty and weak and foolish. You must become a child. My child, like the baby there, that strong sunrise of faith and hope and love, lying in his mother's arms in the stable." And then he continues a few paragraphs later. "My friends, let us be children this Christmas. Take the child Jesus to your bosoms, into your very souls, and let him grow there till he is one with you, your every thought and purpose and hope. Then be happy this Christmas day, For to you a child is born. Childless woman, this infant is yours, wives or maidens. Fathers and mothers, he is your firstborn, and he will save his brethren. Eat and drink, and be merry and kind, for the love of God is the source of all joy and all good things, and this love is present in the child Jesus. The narrator in the story, Adele Cathcart, you might call it even like an everyman, is called John Smith. And in response to this call to what you might call a call to childhood or a call to childlikeness, he says, the baby he spoke about was nothing to me. I didn't love him or want to hear about him. But rather than arguing with Adela or try to point out what she's missing, John Smith listens and pays close attention, becomes what you might call an attentive people watcher. And he notices Adela's response. Now, remember, she's a sick child, which is why I've used this image of a sick child in another George McNeill story called Seawood Parish that actually took place down in Cornwall. As she's lying there, and as the stories, including this White Princess and other stories are told, something kindles in the child. The child, in a sense, is healed and restored. The afflicted, I'll just quote, the afflicted Adela begins to heal. Her spirit is lifted. The light and goodness in each story helped prepare the way for the Christ tale she had not earlier been able to receive. Now, George himself, the father, set you might call it a good example by collecting and playing with toy soldiers. He actually collected a very big collection of toy soldiers, a bit like Patrick Bronte did with his children in the vicarage at Haworth. And he took this line of thought one step further, put forward what I would call a theology of the child, side of the Almighty himself. And I quote, God is childlike, and as he was, is, and ever shall be, divinely childlike. And in many ways, George MacDonald is countering what I would call quite austere images of God, like God being a sort of monarch sitting high in the heavens, ready to strike you dead. He does actually make fairly unsavory comments of Jonathan Edwards. I presume he's referring to Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which was apparently still in the curriculum in America for young people. J.K. Chesterton, in his book Orthodoxy, takes this a bit more further, and this came out in 1908, and I quote, because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free, therefore they want things repeated and unchanged. They always say, do it again. And the grown-up person does it again until he's nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony, but perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning, do it again to the sun, and every evening, do it again to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but is never tired of making them. It may be that he has the eternal appetite of infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. At the end of George MacDonald's fairy tale, The Golden Key, which was published in 1867 in Dealings with the Fairies, there are two protagonists, Tango and Mossy, and again, it's a story which is still in print. They've gone on their adventure, and we're told at the end of the story they were younger and better and stronger and wiser than they had ever been before. For a friend's 56th birthday, George MacDonald wrote her a poem that began with these words: up the hill of years, to the peak of youth. And I think in the basis of all these sort of thoughts and ideas, you think you could conclude that George is saying is that God, or you might say Jesus, wants us to grow young, to become a child again. As with Tango and Mossy and the Golden Key, so with all of us, we grow wiser as we grow younger. And I think this is the clue why these authors, and I've mentioned MacDonald, Chesterton, I can mention Lewis and Tolkien as well, why they make this impression on us, because they're the ones return that we can return to again and again to gain wisdom to live. And they have that profundity within them as writers of children's literature. C.S. Lewis, and I've referred to what he said of MacDonald as his spiritual master, he credits his first reading of fantasies as a life-changing event. And I actually went to the very spot in Surrey just before Christmas. There's a railway station at Leatherhead. I was actually nearby. I think it was Ashstead, to see where MacDonald's funeral took place. And I went along to Leatherhead to see the railway station where Lewis actually picked up George MacDonald's fantasies. And I quote from Lewis: "The woodland journeys in that story, that's of fantasies, the ghostly enemies, the ladies good and evil, were close enough to my habitual imagery to lure me on without perception of a change. It is as if I were carried sweeping across the frontier, as if I had died in the old country and can never remember how I came alive in the new. Or in one sense, the new country was exactly like the old. I met there all that already charmed me in Mallory, Spencer, Morris, and Yeats. But in another sense, all was changed. For that night, my imagination was, in a certain sense, baptized." You could say without fantasies and these fairy tales, there would be no Narnia, no Middle-earth, and I would even argue no Hogwarts. And at the sake of time, I'm just going to come to a conclusion in a moment. Lewis actually, in his novel The Great Divorce, published in 1945, uses MacDonald as his spiritual guide, somewhat similar to Virgil does with Dante in the Divine Comedy. And Madeline Longlew testified, "George MacDonald gives me renewed strength during times of trouble." I just want to come to some sort of a conclusion. I'm using the picture, the manuscript of Princess Linden's actually up in Mintlaw in Aberdeenshire, which you can see there. It's also at the back of the North Wind. So this came out in 1872. This is my little conclusion. I'm going to start with Bob Dylan. I'm going to see his film The Complete Unknown this Monday night because it's my birthday. And Dylan has quite a good line, John Wesley Harding: "The moral of the story, the moral of the song." So I think the moral from all this is find a cozy place and allow your imagination to indwell the story, which what George did. George indwelt the story of Jesus, Christ's birth as a child. He allowed what I would call his inward eye to gain spiritual insight and wisdom. And then like Anodus, which means pathways and fantasies, in his bedroom at the start of the story Fantasies. Look closely at the story, notice the narrative lines as they're carved into it. Then follow with your inward eye until you begin to sense the vibrant living leaves which are for the healing of the nations. And nearby see a rippling brook curving its way through the enchanted scene from the very throne of God. And then follow upstream, for therein is life as God intended it. Or as MacDonald's very close friend and associate John Ruskin once said, "There is no wealth but life." And there I conclude.
Right. John, thank you. That's so interesting, just to come and bring us some insights from our, what I want to call our heritage, and a rich, blessed heritage.
I feel like I'm just sort of like scratching the surface, by the way.
Yeah, no, sure.
So much.
I think you've done very, very well for half an hour. So I think it's a great introduction for the time that you had available. So I thought it was so rich. So thank you very, very much. So let's just throw it out for questions, comments, anything you want to clarify, anything it resonates with, inspires you with. It can be any connections that you want. So thank you, John.
Can I just mention these? Can you see these two volumes, The White Princess and the Gold Key? There's some really nice publications by the Rabbit Room. Very beautifully illustrated as well. So you can get them on Amazon.
and other suppliers. Very good. Thank you, John.
Yes. Yeah, go straight to the Rabbit Room.
I want to ask quite a practical question, John, or maybe of everybody in the room. I had the real privilege of reading George MacDonald's children's books when I was about 20, in my 20s, I think, and I'm very grateful for having that experience. I don't think many people have had, and today's reminding me I need to go back and have a read of them again. And the thing that struck me tonight again is that I think there's a quote at one point you said it's not just about children becoming adults. It's about adults becoming children. And I wonder if you get any thoughts on how we help our churches, particularly the adults in them, to become more childlike and not see it as a thing of the past that you've grown out of.
Yeah, which might touch into I'd be interested to see Andrew's paper on what people think about greatness. Jesus said, what's the words of Jesus about the least? You know how the disciples were all squabbling about who's going to be the greatest in heaven, and Jesus said it's the least among you. In other words, it's the children again, the least among you. They're the greatest in the kingdom. So again, it's a sort of like it turns everything on its head. So I mean, in a sense, it's thoughts about discipleship, isn't it? In life, being more Christ-like. But I find it very interesting. I've given a little example just before Christmas. I didn't actually do this deliberately on purpose, but it just turned out this way. You might say providentially. I was doing a Christingle service. I actually did it on the Sunday morning. And there was about 40 adults there, but I laid everything out, the tables in the middle, did a sort of square, and I had a PowerPoint presentation, and I used stories. And a little 7-year-old turned up called Hazel, and she was the only child there, even when I had about, I don't know how many Christingles to make, at least 30 anyway. And when I saw Hazel, I thought immediately, she'll know exactly what to do with the PowerPoint. So I invited her to come and sit physically in the middle where the PowerPoint was set up. And of course, she felt really, that's the best word for it, really important and valued, sitting right in the middle. And I just found that a very helpful way. And everybody really thoroughly enjoyed that particular service because it was a very different way of doing church for most of their experience. But because what I found in that particular church, you will get adults. I don't know. I'm being a bit simplistic here, perhaps, but they've been disappearing. What I call going down rabbit holes to think about Alice in Wonderland. Get into squabbles and all sorts of little side issues. And here you were, and I said, not really an experiment, but you had a child in the middle, and everybody was centered on the story for Christmas as well. And it brought such life into the heart of that fellowship. People still remember it to this day. So it turned everything on its head.
Yeah.
So perhaps not really answering your question, but think of the physical examples.
And again, it's the benefit of what we shared earlier and what Carolyn's trying to do with the worship in the communities of co-leading and co-organising with children, and yeah, one
And
of my most abiding memories from church ministries where one of the children would just insist in coming and helping me with communion. And so they were so small, they would just run up to the church, and my only way was just to hold them while I sought to do communion. And it's just one of the most precious memories that I have in ministry. Yeah, great. Thank you, John. Any other questions or comments or things that struck you?
Could I ask, you talked about the legacy of Lewis and MacDonald, that it was coming in as I was growing up and my children grew up with it. And we love it. It's part of our heritage, part of our understanding of the way of seeing life. You also mentioned Harry Potter. I've forgotten the author's name, sorry.
J.K. Rowling.
Yeah. And you might think in a way, certainly from a literary point of view, that she is carrying on in that vein. But I would personally, I see a downward turn, that the object of the exercise and the focus is elsewhere, not where we would have it. Yeah. I'm not saying it's evil or anything like that. I'm just saying it's lost its way from the starting point. Are we encouraging, teaching, resourcing writers who will pick up that lantern and carry that torch rather, and carry on with it?
That's I'm sure others can respond to that. I mean, what I would say for J.K. Rowling, I'm not an expert in Harry Potter, but in my mind, she picks up what I call literary devices, entering into another dimension from the likes of George McNeill. She never names her sources, by the way. She's never once named anybody, which is of course her prerogative. But it's quite clear she's part of her tradition. But I think you're probably quite right to say, without knowing anything about her, let's call private faith, I've got no idea. She's taken this, you might say, this tradition off in another direction. I think that's what you're basically saying. And that's probably true. But in terms of people today, I mean, perhaps some of you will know better than I what authors are out there that are carrying on the tradition. Some people refer to, what's this what name? Suzanne, what's her name again? She used to be in Cambridge. She's actually the daughter of a Methodist minister, quite well known.
I know the one you mean.
You know the one I mean, Caroline.
I think Victoria might have some answers.
Oh, yes.
I am really passionate about this. So I'm working publishing, for those of you who don't know me, worked in publishing for 20 years. I'm a Christian parent, and I've also worked with children for long years. I've been a fan of George MacDonald since I was a teenager, and I reread them on a regular basis. And I didn't know until I heard you talking about it why I've enjoyed them so much. I would say The Rabbit Room is a really good place to look. You mentioned it earlier. The Wing Feathers series are really good in terms of people who are alive who are writing. I wouldn't necessarily agree with all their theology, but in terms of the rich fantasy, use of the imagination, but a way that you can explore identity and moral issues and things, that they are, for me, they're the kind of new Narnia books that have less obvious sexism in there. Definitely, my children are both girls, and they still have issues with the fact that most of the adventure and fantasy books seem to focus on boys doing all the great stuff, which it's still problematic, I think, if you're a girl nowadays. But yeah, The Rabbit Room is a good place to look. There's some others there. I'm trying to remember the name of the other place. There's one, The Wilder King, I think, is another series from The Rabbit Room. So those, and they are definitely nurturing authors, aren't they? The Rabbit Room, that's what they're aiming to do there. So those two, I would say, are good.
I've met one of them, Jennifer Crafton. You may have heard of her. She's written stories which have been published by the Rabbit Room. She came to visit me about a year ago, actually. So it's a very interesting person. Yeah. But in a sense, you might argue that but yeah, this is probably a pertinent point from a British, never mind a Scottish English context. It seems to me that this whole tradition of the fantasy myth makers is actually gone to America. We've kind of, in some ways, let go our heritage, I would suggest. That's my general sense of that, which is much to our shame and sorrow, I would say too. We're kind of like now saying, looking to America for these ideas to come back across.
There's a British author who's written the Inkwell Chronicles, which is a slightly more Christian book, which I think is a series again, but very much fantasy. It's the two children in the book are the children of a vicar. And so they are actually kind of kidnapped from the vicarage and go into a whole kind of fantasy world, but very much linked with, I think they go to the pub in Oxford where the Inklings used to meet. So it's very kind of connected again in with this world. But that's definitely British, which is really nice.
I suppose the other person to mention, which some of you I'm sure aware of, is Malcolm Guite, who is a fellow at Girton College in Cambridge. Not that you write, he's a poet, yeah. So I will say that. And he does write in the Church Times, but he's written quite a lot, particularly in the past decade. He wasn't doing this before, back in when I knew him in 2002. He wasn't this field at all, but he's completely changed in the past 20 years. But the past decade, he's really got into the sort of Lewis and Tolkien, Chesterton, and which of course are all Christian. And so he's written books on the imagination, and also in college, SD College too. But he's not focused on what we're particularly interested in, children and childhood. So that I think there's room for us to manoeuvre here.
Great. Thank you, John. I think Carolyn had a hand up.
Thanks, Paul. I just wanted to go back to what you were saying about George MacDonald's, and I think I've written the quote down properly. God is childlike. He is, was, is, and ever shall be, divinely childlike. And then you went on to say that G.K. Chesterton took that further. And I just wondered if there was any more detail in there, and if there was any insights you had about what opposition they had to that perspective, because that feels quite radical, certainly in that time. I think it's quite radical now. And yeah, we're talking about quite a long time ago where, as you say, the culture was very Protestant and very dour.
Yeah. And you might even say, feminine ideas about God as well, which come out like the great-great-grandmother in The Princess and the Goblin story. Yes, there was backlash for George MacDonald, but I would, from my sort of historical point of view, I'm not a big expert in this, but from what I've read, Timothy Larson, for example, writes this sort of stuff, is his ideas did take off, generally speaking. So my view, and maybe Haddon have a view on this, my view is in that latter half of the 19th century in Victorian culture, right in the back of sort of evolutionary ideas, things getting better, these radical ideas did actually take root. I suppose I'm trying to think of some of the even American preachers were Phillips Brooks, for example, and there was others as well. In this country, F.D. Morris, and there was other theologians, A.G. Scott, Thomas Erskine, and Christian socialism. So they did actually take root. My estimation of this, and then I'll come back to the present moment, is that along came the First World War, and the whole thing was just smashed. And then what happened? Along comes Karl. So I'm going to get controversial here. Along comes Karl Barth, and then we get Martin Lloyd-Jones, of course. Keith knew very well, and it was a case of, and I won't even say Lloyd-Jones himself, much as I do admire him. It was kind of like these ideas in the 19th century were kind of just poo-pooed, and you had to go back to the reformers sort of idea. And what I would say now, because there is what I would call a sort of Renaissance, even revival interest in the likes of Jonathan Edwards, which I do value too. Don't get me wrong, but people like John Piper and Timothy, what his surname? He just died last year too. Tim, you know who I mean?
Keller? Keller?
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Timothy Keller. So they sort of they'll champion your Edwards, very high views of God, which is fine. I'm not decrying that. But then they'll actually comment and say George MacDonald wasn't even a Christian. And you can actually see that on YouTube. Piper and Keller's actually saying he's not even a Christian. And yet both Piper and Keller are big fans of C.S. Lewis, who refers to MacDonald as his spiritual master. So I find a lot of contradiction there, personally. In my mind, I have a high view of God, but I love to think, God is down at our level. My image of God is of Jesus holding children. It's not someone sitting going to damn one person and elect another, which was the sort of predestination ideas, in George MacDonald's childhood background. So these things are very pertinent and relevant now because these things are happening as we speak.
It was what you were saying, John. It ties in what you said at the start when I asked the question about the power, the view of what is power, what is real power and authority, and the high view of God is actually, well, God's the opposite of what we often imagine. So we think it's low, but it's actually high. He's servant of all.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously Haddon's looked into this in much more detail than I, but you might argue, and I don't want to get too political here, but Donald Trump is riding on the back of these what I would call American conservative evangelicals, Frank and Graham and whatnot, and they've got these high ideas of big God, but they don't, in my mind, have these ideas of God like a child.
Yeah.
So I find that very interesting.
Yeah.
I think we've got time for one more question before we wrap up and thank John and make some plans. Anybody else want to make a comment or any questions or?
Well, can I just say, I'm not very happy about the way this last bit of discussion has gone, but it's too much for me. But the key thing I want to say is that it was quoted just now where MacDonald says that God is eternally child. What gives me difficulty there is, I think, it's the loss of the difference between God and creature, the loss of the difference between child and adult, for that matter. And I think that I read the whole story of Jesus and the child and so on in Matthew 18, very aware of and keeping in mind that this the relation between differences, and that's what makes it significant, and that's what makes for a lot of the tension and the wonder of it. That God is not child. The adult disciples are not children. But in the entry point, for instance, I think we argue that the way you become a child is by receiving a child. And you don't receive a child by becoming yourself a child. That's no help to the child. And it's no help to the adult either. I mean, one of the blessings of my being old, it doesn't happen to all old people, is that I'm in relation with one or two young people. It's the difference, and it's the actual living in otherness. And I think that I'm not a great expert at all on MacDonald, although I've read a little, but it seems to me it's this playing with the othernesses and the differences, which then give you relationships which are full of potential, of openness, of possibility, because they haven't been dissolved into is. There's not the is, there's not the identity that comes out of it. There's the relation, there's life.
Right, thanks, Haddon. It's a really, really helpful point. John, do you want to just briefly come back on that?
Yeah, the only thing I'd say, like the start of his paper on the imagination, he sets up a very clear distinction between creator and the created. So he doesn't collapse the two. So he keeps the dialectic there quite clear, because some people might have accused him of what, for example, pantheism, like they did with Wordsworth, but MacDonald was very clear about the distinction between creator and the created. So, but it's interesting. I couldn't make much comment about this distinction between child and adults. So interesting,
yeah. Great. Well, thank you. Well, thank you, John. Thank you for everybody's comments and reflections and connections. I think that's been really fascinating. And so, John, thank you so much. People talk about the need to understand our past, to interpret our future and our current situation and present and our future. And you've given us that. And I just love that idea that somebody was writing a paper on Child in the Midst in 1867 and in exploring that growing young and both playful and attitude towards children. I think and to see that heritage and to see that traced all the way through. And as a fan of Ruskin, I certainly want to go back and look at that, because I hadn't quite made that connection before either. So that was a particular interest to me. So thank you. Thank you.
Can I just mention, actually, Paul, I've actually got 2 letters that George, I don't know if you can see that there. I've got 2 letters that George MacDonald wrote to John Ruskin.
Oh, wow. Wonderful.
These are originals. I've got a few.
Wow.
Well,
Wonderful.
And he wrote them because of Ruskin had this sort of, some of you might be aware, friendship with a girl called Rose Latouche. So these letters contain George's pastoral advice in the situation. And they've never been published either.
He certainly would have needed that, that's for sure. So yeah, but anyway, thank you very much. So as we said at the beginning, we have somebody called James Gilbert, who Keith might be able to say some more about, for on the 30th of September. And there's been a few thoughts for the 30th of April. David or Haddon, has anybody got any other suggestions or anything that particularly strikes us as being appropriate for, or other offers for 30th of April?
I think the CT and MAGA, Making America Great Again, would be, it feels really timely.
Yeah.
In the current climate. So that would be, I think that would be really useful to have a discussion around that in April.
Yeah. And David,
sorry, I hadn't put you on the spot.
But David will be doing his studies as well, so it's not like that passion's gonna, he wishes he'd be finished this year, but it might be on his heart and mind and work pattern for just a while yet. So Haddon, how would you be interested in sharing on that? Would you be available or interested for the 30th of April?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Lovely. All right. Well, that wasn't, my word, that's the quickest I think we've ever been doing that. That's great. Well, thank you very, very much. So David, thank you. I think you can see, it's not that we're not interested, just that we want to go with what's some of the relevancy happening in our world at the moment. And
I always would defer to Haddon.
Great, thank you. Well, Keith White, happy birthday.
Thank you. And just a word about James. You said I might just, so James and Elsie have been involved in all sorts of ministry and mission, child related in South America, and their journey has again and again connected with child theology. So it's been a helpful reflection. And one of the important things about CT is we're seeking never to be Western, sort of Oxbridge, European, whatever it may be, Yale, Harvard. And there is a challenge with South America because of language, which is basically other parts of the world, people are more familiar with English. So I hope this is one of the ways in which we can reconnect with that continent. So that's what it's about. One other thing to sow a seed, if I could. Thank you for your birthday greetings. One of the ideas the trustees of CTM have had is that we might have an annual lecture. And I just wanted to keep this in our minds, everyone. So I think we're thinking of the first one being November this year. Anyway, I'm off piece now, but it's something like that. And so when Carolyn was saying, for example, wow, that will be timely, that is child theology and MAGA, I'm thinking, what would be a rubric for the annual lecture? How does it, of the different things that are going on in our events, what might be relevant to that? I just wanted to sow the seed. So it's not just in the minds of the directors.
Yeah,
thank you,
Keith. Yeah, and again, so please in the chat email us some of the trustees are available for that, and yeah. So I'm just mindful of time. Corinne, do you want to stop the recording?